Okay, so this is going to be another presentation on the fundamentals of training for power. So, power seems to be one of those terms that's not really well understood, nor is it used very consistently between professions. So, we have the biomechanists, the physicists, and the strength and conditioning coaches all using power, this term of power, in different ways. So, in this presentation, we want to basically go over what exactly we mean by power from an athletic training standpoint. Why do we need to train for power, and how do we best get our athletes to train for power? So if we look at basically the textbook definition, power is basically the rate of doing work. And this works well with this equation that we have here, this mathematical equation, where we have power equals work divided by time. So that's basically going to suggest that if we can do more work in the same amount of time, or we can do the same amount of work in less time, then we're going to increase power. We also have this equation here where power equals force times velocity, and that's probably more applicable to the athletic performance setting, because we have we can quantify force and velocity a lot easier. So essentially, this equation is going to say that if we either increase force or increase velocity, we are going to increase power. But the fact is that these mathematical equations and textbook definitions don't mean much to sports coaches. They don't care about maths equations. They just care about how is this going to make our athlete better at their sport. So when we sort of define power in terms of specific sports and athletes, it's really going to be dependent on what sport the athlete does and even what position in that sport they play. So for this example, we got three athletes here. We've got a weightlifter, a shot putter, and a high jumper. And if we look at the power required for each of these athletes, they're going to be different. So a weightlifter is going to have very high loads that they're trying to lift, so that force of that power equals force times velocity equation is going to be really high, but the velocity is going to be pretty low. They're not going to be able to lift a weight that heavy weight very fast. They still need to be powerful though, because if they don't have enough speed, they're not going to be able to get under the snatch or the clean or the jerk. A shot putter also needs to be powerful, but they need to be powerful with a much lighter load. So the shot's only going to weigh a few kilos, but they need to be able to propel that as fast as they possibly can in order to throw it the furthest they can. And then a high jumper doesn't really have any external load they're going to move. They're just going to try and propel their own body weight as fast as possible in order to jump the highest. So with that in mind, we have this idea of the force-velocity relationship, and this is basically suggesting that the more load we can lift, the slower we're able to lift that, and the lighter the load is, the faster we can lift that. So if we look at a really simple example, let's take a squat, just a normal back squat. If we get someone to load their 1 RM onto a back squat and they try and move it as fast as they can, it's going to be very, very slow. But the force is going to be very, very high, so it's going to be somewhere up here. If we get them to then put 50% of their 1 RM on the bar and get them to move that as fast as they can, they're going to be pretty fast at moving that, and the force is going to be relatively high. But then if we get them to just move the empty barbell, assuming that's not their 1 RM, that is going to be able to, and we get them to move that as fast as they can, they're going to be able to move that really, really fast, but there's going to be very low force. So that sort of is the basis of how different athletes need different power. So there's different sports and different actions in certain sports that require different levels of power on this curve. So, for example, like we had the weightlifter versus the shot putter versus the high jumper. The weightlifter is probably somewhere up here, the shot putter is probably somewhere around here, and the high jumper needs to be a lot faster. And we can also use different training methods and modes in order to target specific areas and qualities on this curve. Just like we're saying, if we have heavy squats, it's going to be more up this sort of lower velocity, higher force. If we have really fast jumping or running, then it's going to be a lot higher velocity but a lot lower force. And before we get any further, we just got to establish why it's important to train for power. So basically, it's essential for many tasks that we do in different sports. So we got here a guy performing a volleyball spike, and to be able to do that as effectively as possible, he needs to be able to jump pretty high. If he can't jump very high, he's not going to be able to get high enough to spike it down over the net. So for him to be able to jump high, he requires some power. So it's going to be quite a low force because there's no external load, but it's going to be very fast. He needs to propel himself very quickly. So basically, we have like throwing, any sort of throwing, jumping, and running are all going to be enhanced if we use appropriate power training. And just like we had with that force velocity curve, we have slow versus fast power exercises. So if we have, like this guy's doing a heavy squat, that's going to be a lot slower in comparison to this example of someone doing a drop jump. So this is just emphasizing how power cleans aren't the only way to develop power. We have a whole spectrum and range from max strength all the way to max speed. So power sort of sits in between there. So this guy's going to be moving this a lot slower, but with a lot more force. These guys going to be moving a lot faster, but a lot less force. So this is sort of an idea of that spectrum that we talked about. We can have, for example, a 1RM back squat. It's going to be the slowest but most force. Then we have like maybe a 50% 1RM jump squat, for example. That's going to be less force but slightly more velocity. Counter movement jump, so just a body weight jump, is going to be sort of probably somewhere in the middle. It's going to be no external load, and it's going to be quite quick. And then we have things like drop jumps, which are going to be just more. The ground contact times are going to be a lot quicker, so it's a bit faster, a bit less force. And then we have finally like overspeed jumping, which you can do with some sort of elastic resistance. And in order to appropriately train for power for a given sport, we need to identify what is going to be optimal for that. What sort of power profile is going to be optimal? So we can come up with this, usually represented in a spider chart, this sort of power profile. And this yellow, this isn't just a random example. This yellow line is basically our elite competitors. What are they? This is like their normal, their average back squat, jump squat at 75%, jump squat at 25%, counter movement jump, and drop jump. So this is sort of going from slow velocities, high force, all the way to higher velocities and lower force. And if we then have an individual who we test, and we test all of these qualities, we can get an idea of where they sort of sit and if their power profile is sort of matching to what we ideally want. So as you can see with this guy, his back squat is quite significantly more than the average elite in his sport and his position. His jump squat at 75% is his performance is better in that as well. But then when we start getting lighter, his performance actually gets worse and worse. So that tells us that he's very well trained on the force aspect of that force velocity curve. But when we start getting lighter and trying to implement some speed, he's actually worse than the average. So for this athlete, the best way to train is going to be doing more higher velocity type movements rather than high force. So if we have this sort of power profile, we can help determine strengths and weaknesses of the athlete, and help determine what we actually need that athlete to train in order for them to get more powerful optimally for them. So lastly, an example of maybe like a periodized block of power training or periodize a few months of power training. We can start, let's say, for this athlete that we have here, we can start by doing jump squats at about 20% of their 1RM. So we're not doing much of the heavy stuff. We're starting sort of with this more moderate to light stuff, and then we're going to progress that to faster and faster and faster exercises, but still a similar movement pattern. So we're going to go from jump squats at 20% 1RM to box jumps, so that's unweighted. Then we're going to depth jumps, which is dropping from a box and jumping back up as high as possible. And then we're going to move into repeat band assisted jumps. So that's going to give us more that overspeed work and help hopefully try and teach us more stiffness and quickness as opposed to higher force and slower velocities. And that's all we got for today. Thanks for watching.